Hi, this is Batia Wiesenfeld, and I want to welcome everyone to another edition of the Faculty Insights on COVID-19 session. Today, we have an amazing and incredibly packed session for you with 4 presenters. I have all of whom are going to offer different perspectives on remote work and remote working and the technology and policy and organizational implications associated with it. We're going to start with Rob Seamans and then turn it over to Francis Milliken and then Hila, and then I'm going to finish up. So Rob, I invite you to start us off.
Great, thank you, Batia. So I'm going to be speaking about the effect of the pandemic on innovation and some public policies to address at least some of what I think is going on. So for starters, there's no question that the effect of the pandemic on innovation in the immediate term has been largely negative. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence of labs that have had to be shut down, of R&D, ongoing R&D, ongoing experiments, some experiments that have been going on for really long periods of time that have had to shut down. So in the short run, for sure, a negative shock to innovation. Longer term, what we would expect to have happen is that innovative effort will shift into new areas. Again, there's plenty of anecdotal evidence of this. One example that I have listed here is that following the oil embargo in the 1970s, it turns out that as a result, firms in the US started to invest in new technologies, including fracking. There's also a lot more systematic evidence coming out of the innovation literature showing that, indeed, when you have these large negative shocks, it leads in the short run to a negative effect on innovation, but longer term leads to innovation in new areas. So what might be some of these areas when it comes to this shock that we're currently experiencing from the coronavirus? First, let me start by just giving a little plug to the NYU Stern Management and Organizations Department. We've been putting out a series of research briefs around how firms are responding to the ongoing pandemic. And for those of you that might be interested, there's a link that's provided in the presentation, or you could get to it by Googling the department. At least a couple of these research briefs have highlighted some of the ways in which firms are shifting their innovative efforts. And so 3 that I'm going to touch on are remote learning, e-commerce, and telemedicine. Now, remote learning, of course, right now we are engaging in some remote learning, and technologies are slowly getting better around it, and I would expect that we'd continue to see some innovation in this area. I'll talk more about in e-commerce in just a moment. As to telemedicine, what I have at the bottom of the slide is a chart of Google Trends, right? So this is searches for telemedicine. You see a large spike in early March, perhaps no surprise. But what's interesting about telemedicine is that it's been around for a long time, right? There are many physicians that have been trying to push telemedicine, many public health organizations that have been trying to push it, but it really hasn't taken off. And part of the reason for that is that you need adoption on the physician side, and you also need adoption by patients. As a result of the pandemic, we've had a really big shock to this, and we sort of have moved to this new equilibrium where now most doctors' offices are sort of telemedicine enabled, and many patients are starting to use telemedicine. So I think we're going to see a lot more innovation in this space in the coming years. So let me talk a little bit about e-commerce. Some of what I have to say comes from a recent NBER working paper. Again, there's a link to the paper here in the slides. So what's interesting in e-commerce, so we know that there's been a big increase, of course, in e-commerce. A lot more people are engaged in online purchases. I think all of us, now that we're at home a lot more, we've been doing a lot more purchasing online, of course. What's interesting is how this shifts employment from retail to other sectors. And so the sectors that have done really well are the warehousing and storage sectors. That's what you see in that black line in the figure that I have there. And also, it turns out in local delivery, that there's been a very big increase in employment in local delivery. Now, so where's the innovation here? Well, it turns out that firms actually need to invest in a lot of innovation in terms of fitting out their warehouses and fulfillment centers with new technologies. So we will continue to see a lot of innovation there. And we also need innovations in terms of business models, because firms don't just have to ship goods to individuals. They have to figure out ways for how to get those goods back if for some reason the customer doesn't like the good or is not satisfied with it, right? And so the sort of the back-end logistics is actually an area where I suspect we'll see a whole lot of innovation. Now, there's been some recent research showing that as individuals shift their purchasing to online. It frees up time for them. And then the question is, well, what is it that they do with that time, that extra time that they have? It turns out that one of the ways in which people are spending their extra time is by going out more frequently to local coffee shops and spending more money at local coffee shops. I suspect that part of the reason for this is that we actually miss some of the person-to-person interactions that we typically would have engaged in if we had been going to a retail store. I think that there are probably going to be a number of other innovations in this space, or a number of ways at least in which purchasing activity is going to change. And this is certainly an area where I'm going to keep an eye on. So just coming back a slide, the three areas that I listed were remote learning, e-commerce, and telemedicine. Of course, all three of those require that you have a good internet connection at home. And unfortunately, this is an area where, as a country, we have fallen behind. So there are many areas of the country that do not have good broadband access. What I'm showing in this heat map here, so this is on a county by county basis, the areas that are darker in color are areas where you have more internet connections per household, and in lighter, it's fewer internet connections per household. And you see that there's a lot of heterogeneity across the country. And it looks like, just by eyeballing this, that a lot of the heterogeneity here is urban and rural areas. But when you zoom into urban areas, so here, if you can direct your attention to what says figure 4 over on the right-hand side. So now we're going to zoom into some urban areas. And if you look at the map of Washington, D.C., the green areas is where there are more internet connections, red area where there's fewer internet connections. And again, you see a lot of heterogeneity even within an urban environment. You see that in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, San Antonio, at least in the pictures here. And again, you would see this across many different parts of the U.S. Now, it turns out that internet access typically varies by income, and so that explains partially the reason why you have this heterogeneity. So if you turn your attention to figure 2 on the left-hand side of the slide, this is using data from 2014. If we were to look at the data from today, it would look still pretty similar. What this is plotting out is the percent of households that use internet at home based on the income quintile in which they fall in. And what I find really dramatic is when you look at the bottom income quintile, only about half of those households use internet at home. So this is a huge area where we need policy interventions, especially if we're hoping and expecting that people are going to take advantage of these new innovations that we've been talking about. So in terms of internet access policy options, this is an area that I've spent a lot of time doing research and writing for academic audiences as well as for popular press audiences. And so what I've got listed here are 3 different policies that potentially could help to address this. I'm not going to go into detail right now in any one of these. Perhaps during the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk at more length on any of these. But if you're interested, please take a look at a recent article I wrote for Forbes that lays out these 3 policies and talks about some of the pros and cons of these 3 different policies. Okay. With that in mind, with that, I guess that's my last slide. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Frances.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Batia, for inviting me to participate in this panel discussion. I'm going to talk to you this afternoon a little bit about COVID-19 and the switch to remote work and some of the challenges that are inherent or that are becoming apparent as a result of the shift to remote work. If you'd asked people maybe a year ago, did they think that most Americans would be working from home, most managers and most companies would have been highly skeptical of the idea that remote work would be so frequent and so omnipresent as it is now. In fact, in a recent survey, almost 50% of working Americans are now working from home in April, up from about 15% pre-COVID-19. And that figure is actually probably a little bit higher because if you look at this chart, about 10% of working Americans said they'd been recently furloughed or laid off. So at least 50% of Americans, working Americans, are now working from home. Now, the question is remote work here to stay? And we can look at this from 2 perspectives, one being the perspective of companies. And if you look at some of what corporate executives have to say, such as executives at Barclays, JP Morgan Chase, and Morgan Stanley, they say it's highly unlikely that all their workers will return to the office towers in New York City And David Kenny, the chief executive at Nielsen, says that they probably plan to use their New York City offices primarily for team meeting spaces rather than for in-office work. Turning to the tech sector, not surprisingly, perhaps, workers at Facebook and Google and elsewhere can continue working remotely through 2020. And Twitter has said that all of its employees can actually work remotely forever if their position allows them to. Now, how do workers feel about working remotely? Actually, it turns out they like it. 75% of the workers surveyed said that they would like to work remotely at least some of the time. And 54% said that they would like it to be their primary way of working. So if remote work is here to stay, it's important that we spend some time understanding the challenges of working remotely. Understanding and addressing these challenges will be critical to creating the opportunities that remote work might provide going forward, and to avoiding some of the pitfalls that could characterize remote work. To foreshadow Hila's talk a bit, a commonality between the two of us is the idea that you cannot just do more of the same when you're trying to innovate and adapt to a major change and expect to be successful. It's important to understand some of the challenges that remote work has inherent in it. The first of these you're probably familiar with and is called Zoom fatigue. Anecdotally, people are reporting that they experience Zooming for long periods of time to be exhausting. The question is, why is that? Well, it turns out that we're not meant to video chat, actually. Video chat means that we have to work a lot harder to process people's facial expressions and figure out how people are reacting to what we are saying. And also, Zoom chats often lack body language that conveys a lot of nonverbal ideas about what a person is trying to say. So Zoom fatigue means that we're working a lot harder to process information, and especially to try to process what we might call nonverbal cues as we're listening to someone speak. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is distraction. Now that we're working from home, and especially during COVID-19, our children are taking classes from home or going to school from home or not, as the case may be. We can be distracted by our kids. We can be distracted by our pets, by our partner, by our roommates. And also we may engage in multitasking while we are Zooming, such as answering emails or texting. The bottom line is distraction and multitasking negatively affect your ability to pay attention and to concentrate, especially on complex tasks. So far, I think we have two challenges in remote work that have to do with the cognitive processing of information. The Zoom fatigue, showing that it's more difficult to process information in Zoom chats, possibly, and then there's the role of distractions. A third challenge is what I call lack of common ground. It's easier to communicate effectively with people when you have common ground. Common ground refers to the idea that participants in a conversation share some common understandings and assumptions. This is harder to do in remote communication because people are less certain about how people feel about issues or about how what other people know about issues. And so there may be this hesitancy to talk in Zoom communications, in part because you're not sure that you share common assumptions with the people in the conversation. Related to that is a challenge that has to do with the possibility that it will be harder for upper level managers to get information from employees about problems that are emerging or issues that are emerging in the organization. We already know from past research that speaking up about problems or issues to one's boss is perceived as risky. And my hypothesis would be that it would be perceived as even more risky in remote work because of the challenges of lack of common ground and the challenges of being unable to see how people are reacting to the points that you're trying to make. So this may, in part, handicap upper level managers in terms of getting access to complete information about what's going on in the organization. A final challenge I'll call inclusion challenges. And the challenge is, how do you make sure that people feel included when you're unable to see them face to face, for example, in the elevator or at an office lunch? Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, says that what he misses the most about working in person is when he walks into a physical meeting, you're talking to a person that's next to you. You're able to connect with them for about 2 minutes before and after. This is very tough to replicate virtually, as are some of the other soft skills crucial to managing and mentoring. In fact, a recent research study suggests that that people are actually spending more time communicating with people they know very, very well now during this period of remote work, and less time communicating with people that they do not know well. So the challenges of this abrupt change to remote work are captured on this slide, the 5 challenges. And I think a key to being able to take advantage of the opportunities that remote work provides going forward will be trying to figure out creative solutions for dealing with some of these challenges. So thank you for allowing me to participate in this panel discussion. And I'm now going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Hila.
Thank you, Frances. So I will kind of combine some themes from Rob and Frances around innovation in COVID time and the challenges working also remotely for innovation. So my name is Hila Lifshitz-Assaf, and this is brand new research. I'm showing preliminary insights and some stuff that are clear results, and I would welcome any comments and feedback or questions that you have. So I put my contact details here, h@NYU. So what is different about innovating in COVID time, and why am I focusing on that? One clear difference is that we need to accelerate innovation. Saving time means saving life. So how can we innovate in those areas that we do need innovation and that are increasing faster? So I will focus on 2 levels of analysis today. One is the team level of analysis. This is based on field studies that I've been conducting on accelerating teams and their work process for innovation with Sarah Leibovich and Lior Zalmanson, and it's now in press, and the link for the paper will be in the chat. And a new study that I'm now doing with the European Commission in a big effort I'll share with you soon, called EU versus Virus. There we're focusing also on remote collaboration on the team level. And then the second study that I will share towards the end is the organizational level of analysis, what organizations are doing, how they're using new ways of open innovation to accelerate their innovation process. And this is a mixed method study with Karim Lakhani and researchers affiliates in his lab. So why is it so hard to accelerate innovation? To begin with, time pressure impedes creativity. It is very hard to innovate from a cognitive perspective, and Frances was emphasizing, these are new conditions, there is stress, time pressure, does not go so well with opening your mind and thinking outside of the box. So how do we do that? And the additional layer of a challenge is the team level of coordination. So usually it's hard to coordinate with people that you've just met. So what happens when you have ad hoc teams, as many companies and organizations are doing, people that usually have just met either from different places in their organizations or across organizations that are trying to solve together COVID-related problems very fast. So ad hoc plus acceleration, that's very hard. So most of the research that we have so far will tell us that this will fail. So time pressure impedes creativity, and coordination with the lack of a common ground and with the lack of a pre-organized structure leads to failure. But this is happening and needs to happen. So I've been studying that in the last couple of years in health tech hackathons, where you bring people that have just met for 2 or 3 days to solve such emergent and problems that in the end, a very ambitious goal, in 72 hours, you need to hand over a working prototype to a needed user. So this is the paper that I said that is now in press, and you can find it also in the COVID-related part since we updated it to COVID. And there's the new study that I will share with you soon on the COVID-related hackathons as well. But what have I learned from studying this for kind of 2 or 3 years? So I've learned that teams fall into 2 common mistakes. The first one is how to deal with the time pressure. Most teams try to deal with it by compressing the regular organizational processes of innovation, the best practices that we teach and that we know to do, they're just trying to make them faster. So if they're doing Agile or Scrum and they have once a day a stand-up meeting, they're trying to do it once an hour. This does not work. So as Francis also said, we cannot just import our regular processes and expect them to work if we just compress them. The second problem is the coordination. So this is counterintuitive. So actually the way the teams try to work was to fully and clearly coordinate. Since they don't have a lot of time, they just made each other. They wanted to make sure everything is clear and every person knows what they have to do. This does not work as well, unfortunately. This is counterintuitive, so I'm stressing it as well. If you try to really do everything to coordinate fully and clearly, this will lead to failure and lots of frustration. So what does work? What are the good news? How can we make this work? So the first thing is not to try to compress what you know, to understand that these new extreme conditions require new different processes, way more experimental. And the second thing about coordination is do not try to fully coordinate, but instead what we found the teams that were able to produce working products, brand new working products in 3 days, that they did something that we call minimal and adaptive coordination. What do we mean? Minimal means you do not fully agree on the specific measurements and methods and materials of the product or the solution that you're going to build. You only agree on the rough outline and straight jump into experimentation. So time-wise, this was up to an hour of a discussion and then quickly split into individuals and teams that start to iteratively experiment. And the adaptive part comes when you adjust to the results of this experimentation from each other. So that's what helps. But what's happening now, we're adding remote to it, right? So this happened in hackathons when we had in person. What happens when you do remote? So this is the big EU versus virus effort that I was telling you. This is the largest online collaborative effort so far to fight COVID. More than 20,000 participants. 2,400 projects that participated, out of which 120 working projects that are becoming now startups. And I warmly recommend for you to study them. It's open to academics. It's a very interesting project. But I'll tell you what have we learned. So what have we learned? The winning teams, the 120 out of the 2,400, were those that either were teams before, meaning some of their coordination issues were solved before, they had a common ground, or what they did when they just met was that they made sure that they have a visible workflow. Because as I said, you need to adjust to each other. So how can you adjust when you're hardly seeing each other? So what we warmly recommend based on this quick study that we're still kind of analyzing the data is to open cameras, to share ongoing work documents. Do not wait until something is perfect to share with your team members. If you wait until it's perfect, it's too late. So that's kind of what we've learned on the team level of analysis. And if you want to hear more about how to manage such teams for creativity, I created this short animated movie and we will share the link via the chat. Now moving to the organizational level of analysis. So what organizations, what are they doing to accelerate the process? One thing that we have seen is definitely that they're responding fast by using open innovation initiatives. So what I mean by open innovation is a wide variety of collaboration online, crowdsourcing, hackathons, citizen science. So kind of across boundaries, not only with the organization, a few others, something that is open for the population and other professionals to join. And you can see time-wise, and this is kind of showing the graph with the cases in the US, how the responses have grown and are still growing. We're collecting kind of quantitative data of about more than 100 kind of since February right now of these initiatives sponsored by government, universities, and companies. What else have we seen? That since the problem space is so dynamic, the time, that's kind of why I'm talking about time and acceleration, is shortened for this effort. Initially, we thought we understood the problem and people and organizations gave kind of a month or 2 months to solve a problem. Now it's becoming shorter and shorter over time because people understand that the problem is constantly changing and we need to be more agile around our understanding of the problem. And one interesting case that I'm doing kind of a deep dive into is the ventilator shortage problem and the different ways the different organizations attack it. The big lesson that we have learned so far that I can share is that they're designing the process with a full path to implementation already in place. And what I mean by that is most times that organizations are using crowdsourcing or open innovation, they're really focused on finding a solution, but they forget often, unfortunately, what happens once they found a solution. How will it get implemented or adopted? That's where the failure usually happens. And now, because there was a real need, they made sure that the path is clear for implementation in different ways and in new ways. So this is fascinating. And if anyone wants to share more of what they know about it, I'm really curious to hear. So this is it for today. And I'll stop sharing screen and I'll move to Batia.
Thank you. We are definitely in the middle of a remote work revolution that I think my colleagues have highlighted that is changing our work, our organizations, and our cities. And here are one of the things that I think is a big change is the way that remote work has become strategic. For a period of several weeks, it was the most common new topic highlighted by CEOs in their earnings calls. And what we've seen is actually a change in the way that CEOs are talking about remote work. You can see that early on, there was a lot of attention to employee health and business continuity, the orange and gray lines here, but those have fallen off. And what is rising is a focus on real estate and the ways that remote work can save money, and a big focus, the blue line, is that big focus on figuring out how we can take advantage of remote work to restructure our organizations and offer up new opportunities. Remote workers in the past have been overrepresented by either the highest sort of top earners, like many of the professionals that we come into contact with, and also those at the lower end of the wage scale. That's changing under COVID, where it's much more universal. In fact, there's a lot of things that have changed about remote work under COVID. Before, it was low intensity virtual work. People were working virtually just a day a week or a couple of days a week. It was actually 2 days modally. Now, high intensity. Everyone's doing it 100% of the time. Not everyone. Before, it was exceptional. Only 3.4% of workers worked remotely at least 80% of their time. Now, much more universal, over 60%, as Francis highlighted. Before, it was predominantly voluntary, and now it's predominantly required. Before, it was disproportionately female, and now it's much more diverse. Before, the alternative to working remotely was working in the office, and now the alternative is pretty much not working, which we heard. Before, the childcare and elder care, we had a system, an infrastructure that was offering up support. Now that support is either gone or it generates demands, like the demands on working parents to homeschool. So as we reopen, what can we learn from the remote work pre-COVID that we can use to figure out how to manage it post-COVID? Well, first of all, there is some evidence, and I think some of the enthusiasm for remote work is coming from the fact that remote work does seem to improve performance. There is some evidence about how remote work improves financial performance, but it's really very difficult to tease apart the confound of the selection bias. Are there certain kinds of firms that are more likely to have remote work? But then we can turn to the individual level and see what are the impacts at the individual employee level. And you can see there that there is lower attrition among remote workers, and that working remotely really does seem to increase employee performance as rated by their supervisors and on objective ratings of performance. But a lot of that is coming from the fact that people increase their work hours when they work from home. These performance benefits are not uniform. It's much more likely that you will see performance benefits from telecommuting more, from working remotely more, for people who are doing more independent tasks. And it also is true that people who are doing more complex tasks, who are going to be more disturbed by distractions in the workplace, those folks do better and show more performance increases when they work remotely. Employees, it's interesting because basically employees with low social support, these folks are the ones who show a greater benefit from telecommuting more in terms of their job performance. But this actually seems to be, it's not a function of don't support your workers and they'll work better. In fact, it's the fact that when you have a toxic work environment, this same pattern shows in other people's research on things like having a toxic relationship with your supervisor, that a bad work environment is much more bearable and much less likely to diminish performance when you spend less time in it. So basically, working remotely helps people who are in bad work environments kind of manage their work. Some other of the benefits are that there's greater autonomy, greater job satisfaction, lower work-family conflict, and that's two different kinds of work-family conflict, work interfering with family and family interfering with work. And it ends up, people report better relationships with their supervisors when they're remote. Several of these effects are stronger for women than they are for men, but we're seeing, consistent with what Francis highlighted, we're seeing some evidence of women suffering from these effects under COVID. So many of these benefits may not apply to the current crisis. There are a number of downsides of working remotely. Probably one of the big ones that has been reported extensively is that sense of isolation. And that has been true even before COVID times. Some other costs are the socialization of new employees. People who are hired remotely tend to be less committed, more likely to leave, and perceive that they have less knowledge of what's going on in the organization. Professional development definitely takes a hit when people work remotely. And for female professionals working remotely, and females are a disproportionate share, working remotely does seem to lower wages. Some of the benefits of remote work are actually dependent on being the exception, the fact that other people aren't doing this. So this is really problematic in COVID times. So things like improved job satisfaction and autonomy, those benefits are eliminated when others are also remote. And it seems like what happens is when some people are remote and other people are in the office, the coordination and collaboration work gets delegated to the folks in the office. So the remote workers suffer when everyone is remote. What happens when your manager is remote? Well, then in-office workers tend to be less satisfied, feel like they get less professional development, are more likely to want to leave than those whose managers are in the office. But the remote workers benefit from having a remote supervisor. So basically, what many organizations have created to respond to COVID is something like a minimally viable product, the equivalent of just a skateboard to get us from here to there, to kind of triage in this crisis. But what we need now is to actually start iterating on that model and iterating with a number of different models that are going to kind of work for the broad set of organizations and industries that we have now and jobs. So as we reopen, there are a few things to highlight. Number one, we have to recognize that there's an easier way to manage. The easiest way to manage is actually through direct monitoring. It requires a lot less managerial skill and a lot less planning from managers, but it doesn't work as well in remote work. What we need to do to manage remote workers better is we need to create that sense of task independence, sense of control and independence. And that means managing by objectives and not by watching their processes. So contact with your employees is really good, but for information sharing and not for monitoring, not looking over their shoulder. A way to manage them is to create clear, quantifiable, and objective performance criteria and use performance as a basis for promotion. But that requires a fair amount of managerial skill and planning in advance. We also have to not ignore the non-remote employees, so distribute the work of collaboration to avoid burdening them. And recognize that certain kinds of employees, especially as we reopen, are more likely to wish to return to work sooner. What the prior evidence suggests is that we're going to see that happening more with single than married employees, with male than female employees, with younger than older employees, and a host of other distribution concerns. Now, that raises a bunch of diversity and inclusion issues that Francis had highlighted. And possibly one of the things we need to do is reduce some of the incentive or reward to returning by encouraging managers to stay home so you have less visibility benefit from that return. And there are opportunities of reducing barriers to growth, for sort of having a finite office spaces, wider labor force participation possibly, and maybe some of these lower costs. So now I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to highlight, sort of bring everyone together to highlight some of the questions that we have gotten in. I'm going to start with the questions that we've gotten from our colleagues, and then I'll move on to some of, sort of fill in with some of the questions that I have that I have for you folks. So first of all, the first question actually comes from Aninja, and it's a question for Rob. And the medium-term and long-term impacts on innovation may also be confounded by immigration and the current administration's perspective on immigration. And I wonder if you would be willing to speak to that. It feels a little bit different from remote work, though related, because obviously if you can collaborate remotely, then perhaps some of this collaboration can happen from abroad.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Batia. And I always learn so much when I see my colleagues present. So thanks also, Hila and Francis. And India, thanks for the question. I agree that there's sort of three things going on. So there's the pandemic, which has forced us all now to work from home. There's the recession now, which is as a result of the pandemic. Then there's sort of a bunch of policy responses, and there are many different types of policy responses. And one of which, unfortunately, has been changes to the immigration laws that we have in this country. And so sort of disentangling all of those is going to be tricky. There's plenty of research, including research by colleagues that we have here at NYU Stern, such as Petra Moser and Mike Waugh, who have spent a lot of time sort of looking at the link between immigration and innovation. And there's a positive link there, right? As you increase immigration, particularly of high-skilled immigrants, you see positive effects to innovation, positive effects to productivity. And so we're going to be missing out on that. Of course, as I was saying, disentangling that from some of the other things that are going on is going to be difficult.
I think this question, which was posed by Maria Patterson, is very relevant for both Francis and definitely for Hila. And so Maria's question is about what is the impact of group size on innovation and collaboration remotely. We certainly have seen it, when you're Zooming, that is there an impact of being able to kind of in this Zoom world collaborate when you can't see everyone on your screen. And Hila, you certainly were working with sort of large scale. Francis brought in the expertise of these speaking up in these groups. So I wonder if the two of you might have a perspective on that question. Maybe we could start with Hila and then move to Francis.
Sure. So indeed, I worked now with the EU versus virus hackathon. We've had a crazy amount of people, but still, even in this large scale of more than 20,000 individuals, they made sure that when there was work sessions of the teams, they did not exceed the usual, let's say, recommended size of a team group, which is usually between 4 to 6 individuals. So the way they did it was dividing, I would say, the technology tools. So Zooming was through this kind of good size of 4 to 6 people. Slack was constantly the place where the action happened. So basically everything lived on Slack. So for those 3 days, which happened every 2 weeks, we all lived on Slack, which was an interesting experience because I'm used to regular physical, hackathons and events where you go into. And so the first thing I felt was, where is the event happening? How do we know? How do you get 20,000 people feeling connected that they're in the same environment? So Slack was the home. So I would say it's important to try to think as a company or as a manager, like how do you create, what is the home? Because Zoom is not enough. And then when you do the teamwork, then it went to Zoom and those collaborative tools that we kind of all know from Google, presentations to doc, etc. But Slack was leveraged to its maximum, I would say.
Francis?
So, what we know from research on Teams prior to working remotely is that the optimal size is somewhere between 4 and 7 for communication. So it sounds like, Hila, that in your hackathon, they sort of got that idea and they broke out people into smaller groups. And I think that that's, going to be similar on Zoom. I suspect that the coordination problems in larger groups on Zoom will be even greater than the coordination problems in large groups face-to-face. And the reason I would say that is because of the problem with the nonverbal cues, trying to figure out like who wants to speak, for example, in a very large Zoom group. Can create problems, can create coordination challenges. And then sometimes when people experience those challenges, they might decide that it's just too difficult to speak up or to make their contribution, and they may not speak. So I think, bottom line, I think team size will matter a lot in remote groups.
Now I'd like to turn it to more Armoni's question, and I feel like it's actually relevant to across the board. So each one of us touched on an issue of inequality in various different ways, and Moore is asking, what impact will these changes, a variety of these changes, I think, what impact will it have on inequality in the US? Maybe we can start with Rob, because you shared with us some of the demographic data.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And Batia, I completely agree. I think we can all speak to sort of different dimensions of this. More, I think your intuition is correct that that there's, the fact that it's really important to be connected to the internet right now, and coupled with the fact that there are many people that actually don't have great access to the internet or no connection at all, means that there's going to be, that this will likely lead to an increase in income inequality, absent any type of policy response, right? So that's sort of the additional thing we have to add. It's likely, but policymakers are aware that there is a big digital divide. Policymakers have been considering policies to address this. And so it wouldn't surprise me if there's at least some attempt to try to address this a little bit in terms of taking care of some of these spatial inequalities that I was talking about in my presentation.
Maybe Francis or Hila?
So the inequalities that I think about are maybe, within the set of people who are working remotely, whereas Rob is thinking about the inequalities in access to technology and the capability to work remotely. But within organizations where people are working remotely, I suspect that inequality will increase. And the reason why is the lack of this kind of casual contact between people that might occur, for example, in hallway conversations, or in the elevator, or in the kitchen. So these things are not occurring, and those are times when people have the opportunity to interact with people who are very different from themselves, perhaps different hierarchical levels, or more interaction possibly across racial lines and across gender lines. So this piece of research I was describing earlier suggests that what's happening in the Zoom world is that people are talking a lot to people they already know, what are called strong ties in the research on networks. And what has been reduced is the communication to people that you don't know as well, and that's the weak ties. But weak ties are really, really important to creativity and innovation, past research has suggested. And weak ties would be more probably connections to people who are different from yourself, whether that's on gender or on race or on hierarchical level in an organization. So I would have concerns about increased inequality in organizations as a result of remote work.
If I can add on inequality, I do not know enough about within the US inequality and its impact, but I have experienced in these last couple of months the global inequalities. Yes, this was a global effort that we did, and it was very clear to see the difference specifically with Africa. And I think it results, some of it is from what Rob suggested around the technology and the broadband and the infrastructure. So the digital divide is very clear. So we had to, first of all, from a creative perspective, we had to think of very different solutions. How do you educate and get medical education and training to physicians when you do not have Wi-Fi, when you do not have actually broadband? So all the telemedicine that we have talked about in the US is very different and less relevant in some places because they lack the technological infrastructure. So I would say in that case, we were actually feeling on the side that can help. So NYU was one of the most, and Stern specifically was one of the most contributors actually to those countries that needed more. So in those hard days, I think we feel a lot of problems within the US. Maybe it helps to broaden the scope and see that in some cases on the global scale, we are better off with those technologies and we are able actually to help other countries that are still struggling with COVID and with the lack of technologies and the infrastructure.
These are great insights. I want to add just one point that I think that there could be, contingent on what Rob highlighted and other technologies like 5G actually, I think there could be a real opportunity going forward for diminishing some forms of inequality. So one of the things about remote work is that it does make it possible for moms to come back to work earlier. It makes it possible for, it's very good for Americans with disabilities. It turns out that there are a host of people, for example, the LGBTQ community is more likely to be represented among remote workers, and it creates much more opportunity for them. And I think that one of the things that we realize is that there's so much inequality as a function of, honestly, housing and the concentration of opportunities in certain regions, particularly around major metropolitan regions. And if remote work enables that broader participation, then it could actually be a tool for reducing inequality in the US. But again, and I just feel like I'm reflecting exactly what Rob, Hila, and Francis said, it's all contingent on sort of creating an infrastructure. So this is something that policymakers and corporations have to work together to make sure that we've got the infrastructure to make this something that increases participation and diminishes inequality instead of exacerbating it. Maybe I'll turn now to Dick Berner's question, which actually relates to something that Hila brought up as we were preparing for this. So Dick Berner raises that several of our observations seem to apply to remote teaching and collaborative research. And I really feel like this is the question of like, what's the role of researchers in this? And what can we learn about this for academic for sort of furthering academic goals, both research and teaching, and wonder if any of you, I think I want to start with Hila because she did think about this earlier, and then have the rest of you weigh in.
Sure. So Batia indeed knows that I've become very enthusiastic, I would say, in this last period about our role as academics and what can we change about it and what are the academic policy implications, I would say. So if we talked about accelerating innovation in the sciences, in technologies, what about the social sciences? What about business schools? So a few things that I think are kind of, let's say, my academic policy recommendations and things that I'm still thinking of how to do it. And if anyone has examples that they see, I would love to hear and learn from them. So one thing is open access. So one way to get our research output faster out there and with a broader impact, and to, it also solves a lot of the inequality issues that we're talking about, since many people do not have the ability to read a lot of our research. So open access to anything related to COVID, to me, is a must. This is a public good. We are, this is something that has to change. So many journals have changed it, and maybe many publishers have changed it. But I warmly recommend to all researchers, and myself included, I had to negotiate in this period, for instance, when I'm doing this special issue with Elsevier, that it has to be open access because it's COVID related. So it's not still obvious in the social sciences, we are behind. So the medical sciences and the physical sciences, chemistry, genomics, name it, it's they understood it and they're even temporarily opening it. And we are still behind on that. So that's one way. It's kind of in the end of the funnel of our work. It's kind of to push it out there so other people can build upon it and really use what we're doing. And in the start, I would say, of our work in the data collection and what we're doing, the way we're doing research itself, that's, I think, still an open issue of how can we do it in a more open, collaborative way. And there are different ways to go about it, but I would say we haven't found a good answer yet, mostly due to kind of the incentive structure of academia, I believe. But I would love to hear more from my colleagues and what they think about it.
Rob or Francis?
I'll offer a very quick thought that I think applies both to the teaching and research part of the question, Dick, that you asked. The technology that we're using right now, this Zoom technology, it's pretty good. I like Batia's description of this as a minimum viable product. What I feel like I really miss out on are the sort of happenstance interactions with either colleagues around research or around, with students around what it is that they're learning in the classroom. So in the case of students, if we were teaching at Stern, I would be bumping into students in the hallway, in the elevator. There'd be the chance to sort of deepen relationship via just some chit chat, but also they could ask me about something that might not be going, that they don't understand in class, and that's useful feedback. So there's all of that on the teaching side that we're totally missing out on. On the research side, I was remarking to Batia and Hila about this on Sunday. So many of my research ideas have come from academic conferences, not from seeing other people present, but just from bumping into people in the hallway and starting up a conversation, and it sparks an idea that then leads to research. And the technology interface that we're using now doesn't allow for those sort of happenstance interactions. Everything is planned. You get a Google invite to attend a Zoom webinar, right? Or you set up your class and that's when you see your students. All of those sort of little happenstance things are missing, and maybe there's a technological solution to it, or maybe there's sort of a behavioral solution. I'm not sure, but I do really miss that.
Anything you wanted to add, Francis?
I guess this is on a slightly different note. In some of my Zoom conversations over the last few months, I have been struck by the diversity of our experiences, and how, I guess this relates to the common ground point I was making earlier, how we have such a minimal understanding of the circumstances in which other people are operating now. And I think that definitely applies when thinking of our role as teachers and trying to understand our students, and trying to understand how difficult is it for them to log in, what's going on in their house, how many people are living in their house, has anyone in their family gotten sick from COVID. There's so much information about the diversity of people's experiences that we're lacking, and I think that's a real challenge in teaching, to try to figure out how can we somehow use this technology in some way to connect individually with students, to try to understand a bit more about their personal experiences so that we can help them optimize learning.
So a question that we got from Moore is a question about what's the impact of the homeschooling on kind of parents' ability to innovate and be creative and engage with their work. And I do think that in prior research, I'm going to just try to respond to that a little and then welcome your comments, but in prior research, so not so much focused on innovation, but in prior research, what has been demonstrated is that work that generally working remotely diminishes the interference of work on family. And and that is especially true for women, but it's kind of across the board for men and women. There aren't any differences in the role in how much interference of non-work impacts work. But I think that that's one of the things that we are starting to realize is how that those interferences are much greater. And I think that we're going to see that continue because it looks like public schools are likely to not, with social distancing and all of that for the foreseeable future, until we really have a vaccine that everyone is going to get, we may not go back to having all the infrastructure that we have had. And the question is, what can organizations and what can policymakers do to address what definitely does seem to be a drag on the attentional resources of our workforce and the sense of conflict and stress that we know stress generally undermines creativity. I wonder if Francis or Hila or Rob, we're all kind of living with this. I know I've got 4 kids and a husband, all of us competing for bandwidth here. So I guess we're all sort of living with this. Wonder if any of you have any reflections.
I can say about accelerating innovation. So unfortunately, I usually like to be optimistic and I love kids. But they do have, they or any other distraction, I think as Francis talked about distractions, have a negative effect on accelerating innovation. So we haven't checked it, at least not me or none of my colleagues in this period, but what we know from before, part of the magic or the ability to do accelerated innovation has to do with putting everything else aside, the lack of distraction. We are constantly working, even when back then, when we used to work in a regular work environment, all those distractions and the phone in the meeting, and that was bad for innovation when it needs to happen fast. So I actually think that's a negative effect for accelerating innovation. For some longer term creativity, I do not know, open question, maybe, but when we need to do something fast and to find creative solutions for things that are related to COVID, technological or scientists that are working from home, and I think that relates to Rob's first slides about the kind of negative productivity of scientists, of engineers. That's not going well with having kids in the house. And we do need to think about employers, co-parenting solutions. And I know different countries, by the way, have started, when they started opening up, they did not went from homeschooling to school. Some of them went to grouping of families, and then parenting could happen. You can work for 3 days and 3 families at the parents. All kind of interesting. I think Europe is really interesting in that case because you can see the variation across the policies in the different countries and how they open differently. So in that sense, it's interesting to watch, and maybe they can provide data. I do not know it yet.
I know we're sort of running out of time, but I'll just very, very quickly add. I mean, I completely agree with everything that you both have said about the likely effects on creativity and innovation. I think the only thing I would add is just echoing something that Francis said earlier about not knowing what's going on with our students, and it's the same thing with our colleagues. I would expect that these effects vary greatly across families. With children, depending on, of course, number of children, ages of the children, the specific sort of behavioral and emotional needs of different children, and maybe number of working adults in the house. And, there's just so many sort of dimensions along which this varies, and the experience is probably very different for many different folks. It'll be an interesting thing to study, looking forward several years in the future, what the effect of kids in the household during this time period is on creativity and innovation.
Okay, I guess we've kind of run out of time, but just to reinforce it, it does seem like one of the things that's happened with COVID is that we've seen how large organizations, rather than the smaller ones, seem to be more agile. This is definitely a crisis that has played to the strengths and innovation capability of those large organizations. And a big part of it is being able to provide some of this, to have infrastructure at scale. And I feel like that that is what's needed, highlight some of the things that Rob and Hila were both just talking about. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and we will have the video up ready in a couple of days. Thanks all, and see you next week.